distinguished scholars in the field of early Chinese literature. He's professor of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures and also the Dean of Humanity at the University of California, Los Angeles. He received his PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University in 1996. Before that, he also studied at Stanford University and National Taiwan University. Professor Scabers has published numerous pioneering books and articles on preaching Chinese historiography and thought, Chinese poetry, and Chinese Greek and Latin comparative literature. His monograph, A Patent Test, Form and Thought in Early Chinese Historiography, received the prestigious Joseph Levinson Prize of the Association for Asian Studies in 2003. He was also awarded the 2018 Patrick D. Hannan Book Prize for translation of the AES for his collaborative translation project, Zuo Tradition or Zuo Zhuan, Commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals. Professor Scabers' work is famous for its comprehensive and groundbreaking scholarship on Chinese historiography, anecdotal narrative, and rhetoric, which offers important insights that are not only relevant to the field of early China, but also to the related topics in later periods. His more recent work addresses the history of oratory and ritual speech genre. And today, his topic is Before Sincerity, Literary Pragmatics, and Early Chinese Poetics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Scabers.
If I promise really to project, can I put this down? Can you hear me in the back if I speak this way? Great. Please let me know if I stop being audible. Because I do want to communicate, but a lot of things to move around. Thank you, Yuxiao, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Wenbei, and everyone you worked with to make this conference happen. Thank you for the invitation. As I was mentioning to someone earlier, I actually chose to come because it was a graduate conference, and I think that the kind of liveliness of exchange of ideas that are fresh and new from people who are really dedicating themselves completely to scholarship at this moment is especially refreshing for me. I'm not devoting myself completely to scholarship right now. And I have to confess, I want very much to confess feelings of nervousness, feelings of uncertainty. I know that all of us have those things when we present, but I want to make sure that everyone here knows that all of us have those things when we present. Today I'm going to try to talk about some ideas related to the Shidaxu and an interpretation of the Shidaxu that I've been working on for a number of years. And I've given earlier versions of this talk in 2006 and 2010, and I'm now revisiting the ideas. I call it Before Sincerity because by the time we get to the end of it, I'll be questioning exactly what zhi means in that famous formulation, shi and zhi, the poem, the shi poem, speaks the zhi, the intent, or whatever zhi means in that context. We'll be questioning that on the basis of a rereading of the Liu Yi, the so-called six principles, if that's what that word means. The six principles, or Feng Fu Bi, Xin Ya Song. These things are listed in the Great Preface, the Book of Poetry. All of us encounter this. And the normal way of reading this, a lot of questions about this. What does E mean? Why are they these six instead of some other six that we'll see later on? Why not 5 or 7? Why this order? What does each of the terms mean? And to repeat, by the time I get around to the end of this, I will have called into question all the ways we think about these terms and their meaning now. The model that underlies our reading of these things in the context of Shidaxu is a model of composition. These things are thought to stand for genres or for types of poems. Here we see Feng Ya Song Zhou, Shi Pian Zhi Yi Ti, Feng and Ya and Song, according to the commentary on the Hmong poetry, are supposed to be different T, to your discussion of T earlier, different genres, let's take it, different forms. And then we see that Feng Ya Song Shi Zhi Cheng Xi, these are the forms that that the shi can take. While on the other hand, Fu Bi Qing Zhe, Shi Wong Zhi Yi Ci, these are different types of words that you find within the poem. So on the one hand, a type of poem, on the other hand, a figure of speech that one finds within the poem. mind that at the time when this was likely written, so far as we know, there had not been any Shi poems composed in China for 5 or 6 centuries. That's an exaggeration. Let's say 4, just to be on the safe side. A little thing in Xunzi is a possible exception, and there are some things in the recovered text that may be exceptions too. At least from the perspective of Shidaxu, as it looks back, it doesn't see a lot of newly composed poetry, Shi poetry, in the preceding centuries of the Western Han, if indeed it was composed during the Western Han and during the Warring States. So the notion that somehow this is setting things up to guide us as we think about how we might compose a poem. Am I going to compose a feng or a ya? Am I going to put a b in there, or am I going to just do straight fu? It's a little strange. People weren't necessarily sitting around thinking about how to compose a shi. They were doing plenty of poetic activity, but they weren't necessarily calling it shi. E shows up in a number of other places, and you'll see that I'll be relying on texts that are sort of outside our main ways of reading about shi poetry. Here I go straight to Kongzi Jiayi, which has a whole chapter on argumentation, Bianzhang, and here Kongzi is made to say that when the loyal official is remonstrating with his ruler, there are 5 principles, 5 types, it seems. And the one I'm interested in here is the first, 决谏. The other ones rarely show up. Occasionally you get mentions of 直谏, which would be straightforward. Hey, you're wrong, stop doing that. Stop tweeting. 决谏, I don't know, it would be nice maybe over dinner and drinks to fantasize about the appropriate indirect remonstrance for our times. 决谏 is a kind of craftiness. And then down at number 5, we've got 奉谏. We'll be coming back to that. For me, it's a little weird to have both 决谏, a crafty remonstrance, and 奉谏, which clearly has something to do with indirection. A little weird to have them in the same place. But you can see why I think of this passage against the Shidaxu passage, or vice versa. Okay, whoops, I've now made a terrible mistake. Let's see. Okay. We've got other lists which are not identical to this, but resemble this, other lists of types of remonstrance. They're not always gathered together as 5 principles or anything like that. But it does illuminate something about that listing of different types of poetry. There was clearly an effort to do poetic summations of functions having to do with poetry. Now the Zhouli also does something like this. It's got Liu Yi, but it calls them Liu Shi. So here's that passage, right? And these are part of the responsibility of the Tai Shi, the great master. My cursor, excuse me. And some help with it.
We can see the cursor.
Oh, see, I don't want you to be able to see. Excuse me. I need to scroll down in my notes. That's
就刚刚我好像149的剧情开始爆炸。
very awkward. Sorry. Please. What I want people to do is scroll down. That's it. All right. So obviously these 6, as expressed here, are useful somehow in connection with music, as you can see from the bottom. These 6 forms of poetic activity, which correspond perfectly with Shidaxu, are also coordinated with the Liude. They are the basis of that, and they are given sound, tone, musical content by pairing with these 6 Liu. Look now into the duties of the duties of Tai Shi during the great sacrifice and other related things. what we'll see here is that this phrase comes forth. During great occasions of mourning, Taishi has to lead the blind musicians and qin. This qin is sometimes lost as xing, and that interests me a great deal. What it seems to mean here is something like getting the music started, getting things moving in the funeral. He then goes on to have duties for the encoffining and the assignment of a posthumous name. We get a little more information on what's happening here when we look into the passage on the gumeng. So here we have the duties of the gumeng, basically setting up musical instruments, along with a little bit of duty for song toward the end there of the white passage. Then we get into the things that seem to relate to the question of uses of poetry. 奉颂诗、试炼戏、琴瑟、长久的六世之歌、太师. So serving the great master, but doing these things, especially 奉颂诗, a little difficult to break this down. I'm not sure exactly how it works. It may be that this person is both fenging and songing poetry. These are both functions of this person. It doesn't seem to match well with feng as a form of poem. Indeed, it's not written the same way. It doesn't seem to match with song as a form of poem. Sometimes this song is used interchangeably with that other one. Something else is going. This is an activity with poems, and it's described in Zhou Li well outside of Shi Da Xu. And then we have these other aspects of poetic activity, including Liu Shi Zhi Ge, which seems to separate the singing from the lyrics. I think that's something that comes out for me as I read through these passages. And when you really look down at it, Shi seems to be distinguishing the words from the melody that we're going with them, and even from the rhythmic pronunciation of them. We'll see some traces of that later. I think what we're pushed to by this passage and by the ones that preceded it is a vision of a kind of system of general remonstrance. We're not talking about types of poems, we're not talking about figures within poems, we're talking about poetic activity. And it reminds us of passages like this, and we'll try and there are a number of passages like this scattered through texts. In fact, David Leibowitz's very fine recent dissertation does a good job with passages like this. It's kind of order of remonstrance if you look into it. There are these fantastic visions whereby the ruler would be surrounded by all of us in our different levels, all of us remonstrating with him in the correct way that's appropriate to our position. And for the blind musicians, their medium is shi. We have the artisans who seem to be reciting remonstrances, and that's intriguing. But they're all forms of speech activity. And they're all designed, as it says down at the bottom here, to remonstrate about the loss of norms. Also very evocative in this moment. Remonstrating about the loss of norms. So one of the functions of poetic activity is to call the ruler to recognize the changing, the loss of norms. So let's pursue that a little bit. Looking now into this other passage from Zhou Li, we get a description of the great overseer of music. And what I'm really interested in here are these two parallel lines here. So with the virtues of music, he teaches the young princes of the realm all of these virtues. And then, in perfect parallel, with the spoken discourse appropriate to music? I don't know, let's think about what it might mean. He teaches the young princes of the realm to do all of these things. Xing, Dao, Feng, Song, Yan, Yu. So another 6, and these sets of 6 are especially common in the Zhou Li discussion of these matters. I'm not sure why. And then we get some ideas about the function. What is it for? It is to put the guests at ease and to give pleasure. I think it's in this case, to give pleasure to people from afar. It would work fine as persuade as well. I think that it's more about pleasure here. Let's take a look at what Zheng Xuan has to say about this in his commentary on Zhou Li. It's an interesting position for Zheng Xuan. On the one hand, he's commenting on Shi Da Xu and making sense of Liu Yi there. And then he's commenting on Zhou Li and making sense of a very similar set. So he defines Xing as using some good thing to praise through comparison, some good activity. Interesting. That reduces Xing to a he equates Dao with Dao, and gives us this intriguing vision of speaking about the past in order to kai, jinya, to cut away this kind of Procrustean approach to the present, where you approach it through the language of the past and say, this is what's wrong, this is what's right, a measured present against the past. I think, again, of the embodying function there. Then he gets into Feng and Song, which I think are really, well, Feng especially is going to be the trickiest one for us. He says it's about memorizing. So reciting from memory, it does seem to mean memorization here. While, in a departure from parallelism, he says, 以手节制约手. So he's coordinating Feng and Song in an interesting way. So does this mean that if I simply recite to you the words of the poem without doing anything to it, especially without stylizing my language in any way, then I'm Fenging you? And then if I do it a little bit more Songish, then I'm Song, maybe. And that's perhaps one way of distinguishing what's happening here. A manner of speaking, that may be what it's referred to. To start a bit of language is yen, and to engage in dialogue is yu. Those things don't concern us as much, except to show that thoughts about how to use poetry are being put right aside, right next to other thoughts about how you use language in official situations. Next, let's look at the 6 principles one by one and think through them. And I welcome some warnings if I'm getting close to like 40 minutes or 45 minutes or something. So let's get into the first of them, which in some ways is easiest. It's easiest to get from Shudaxu to another place with this one. Here are the commentaries on Shudaxu, 佛之言波, 是佛成戒之正教善恶. So, we're all familiar with this stuff. Fu is just saying it straight out. Talking about current political matters. So the king is ruling and the ministers are bad, or whatever it might be. And then there's a kind of emphasis of this, also about straightforwardness. This would be the 0 degree of communication, either in poetry or through poetry. But is it in poetry or through poetry? You know, when the Mao Shi, Xiao Xu talk about it, I don't think they typically identify something as full. That's just the default. If they don't call it something else, it's called full. But I don't think this is something that happens within poems. You can read it that way, but it doesn't do any work, and it never happens in early texts. There's never an early text that says, oh, this poem is an example of fu. No, on the contrary, fu is something you do with an existing shi, or with a shi that you just made up or heard somewhere, right? So if I'm visiting you and talking to you, you might well ask me to fu. This happens lots and lots of times, and so what I was referred to earlier today. When you go to an international meeting or something, it may well happen as part of the banqueting, and especially things that go with the covenants, where that you'll get into a banquet where you are invited to recite. And this is an especially nice passage that I'm alluding to here. We'll come back to it another time later. Because what we have here is the invitation from the host. This is the ruler of Zheng, who gives a banquet for the 7 powerful family heads of Zheng, and then invites each of them. I'm sorry, no, it's a visitor to the state who then invites each of them to recite. I mean, it's the Jin ruler who's visiting. So, 请接佛以作君号. So, please, each of you, recite for me in order to bring to completion the gift of your ruler to us. And I will also take advantage of this opportunity to observe the zhi of you 7 gentlemen. And so they go forward. I hope some of you read this scene. It's a very interesting one where they recite poems that we know from Shi Jing. And then each of them apparently choosing according to his own zhi. And then each of them is judged or ji by the viewers, observers afterward, and a judgment is made about their individual characters. So that observation is an interesting aspect. And then after it's over, we get this assessment. And what's fascinating for me is how language that we're familiar with from Shudaxu and from Lunyu starts to show up here. What is going on? So first of all, he invites, after, when they're doing the commentary, they're talking about Guoyuo, who is destined to be assassinated a few years after this. And they say, 是言志. Poem is there to speak about zhi. Indeed, that's what he's been invited to do. goes on to point out that he has the wrong 之, he has an insubordinate 之, 是不其上, so how is he possibly going to survive? Look a little further into the passage. Other things show up in the judgment of other characters who have recited. 乐而不慌. Answer. 乐而不慌, 哀而不伤, right? This is the commentary on Guanju from Hongzhi himself. And then Wu Yin is there too. It's strange how Guanju and a lot of words that are connected with Guanju gather here. Well, you can see what I'm saying about Fu. Fu doesn't seem to be a name for something basic that happens in poems. It seems to be a name for something basic you do in the use of poems. And the use of poems in highly charged settings, where it matters what you say. You're possibly representing yourself as an individual, you're possibly representing your family, certainly in this case, possibly representing your state. It takes us right back to this passage from Gun Yu. When Confucius is talking about the poems, he says, look, if you can memorize all 300, that's fine and everything, but if we give you administrative responsibilities and you can't carry them out, you can't that's very much a word about communication, right? And if we send you on a diplomatic mission to some other part of the world, but you cannot 转对, you cannot answer an invitation or answer another person's recitation on your own initiative, and you're not going to be able to call home. You'll have to represent your state's 志 or your own 志 through that judgment. You'll have to be able to 转对. If you can't do those things, then why would you even need that memorization? Memorization is meaningless without the skill in use that goes with it, at least according to this passage from this text. I've already talked about this. Let's see. Let's move on to B. B is usually regarded as as a fundamentally critical analogy within the poem. And again, it's regarded as a part of the poem. Again, it's a little squirrely because when you really look into the Xiaoxu, I don't think you'll find things labeled as B. Right? Xing, that gets identified. I don't think that Xiaoxu tells us, oh, this is a B. So it doesn't fit very well with the notion that this is a figure of speech within poems. There's lots of other stuff to do with it. I think B probably means this. I think B is when, like Shu Sun, I can't remember which Shu Sun it is, but he's having a meal with Qing Feng, who is this terrible sort of regicide character who leaves Lu and goes to Qi, ends up in Jin, and then gets executed by Chu Lingmeng. But he's not an educated man. He's just a power grabber, very talented in that way. And Shu Sun tests him in the most prestigious and elite way by reciting Xiangshou to him, which is about as bald an insult as you can give someone, right? You're a big rat, you're consuming all of our wherewithal. I can't remember exactly how it goes. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. What it suggests is that, at least in this kind of case, the recitation of a poem could function as an invitation to see yourself in that comparison. There are other figures of speech and other uses of poetry that work that way here, but I'm just getting at the notion that this one is about setting out the very straightforward comparison. Rat, human being, right? Some other examples here. Here we've got Xu Chen convincing Jin Wengong that you can indeed employ someone who has formerly been opposed to you. And we get down to the bottom part here, and you can see that this Shi poem ends up providing an apt metaphor for a person who is of uncertain loyalty. So you choose the part that's good, Wu Xiati, leave behind the part that you don't want. Hey, I confess I don't totally understand this because Cai Feng and Cai Fei, Feng and Fei are supposed to be tubers, root vegetables, so I don't get why the Xiati is not good for the plants. I don't actually understand the analogy. So maybe we can work on that in conversation afterward. In any case, what's happening is that the speaker is choosing a passage, he's citing it in such a way as to invite comparison person to natural figure within the poem. So again, it's a form of poetic activity. There's nothing intrinsically Yi-ish about the Caifeng Caifei within the poem. Its relation to the other material is uncertain, but in relation to the discourse, to the speech being made here, is absolutely clear. Another little passage. When we get praise for characters in Lun Yu who know how to use the poems, it seems to be on the basis of their ability to see precisely the comparison. So here's Zigong being praised early on in Lun Yu for seeing that can be related, can be compared, can be an analogy to self-cultivation. Great. I think the same trick happens in this next one, right? It turns out that those lines on beauty and on contrast and on loveliness of eyes and smiles and so forth, in the poem, they seem to bring in the question of comparison to painting. Zigong brings that into the moral world, adapts the analogy to the moral world, and gets the resulting praise from Confucius. So perhaps this is the kind of speech activity that's being referred to as the, and it's a use of poetry, a particular use of poetry in analogy. We're aware from Han Feizi that prose writers could be critiqued for having too many analogies in a row. It creates a certain punkiness of the prose style. So in the Nanyan chapter, Han Feizi says, 多言繁称, if you say a lot and make lots and lots of allusions in that, 连类比物, if you bring together types and put things together in comparisons, then your discourse, your speech will look empty and useless. So there seems to be some sensitivity to how comparisons, how were being used in speech, and that to me suggests that there's another dimension of meaning. It's not simply poetic within the poem, it's more about forms of speech. Xing is notoriously the difficult one. Here are the Zhengxuan and other earlier looks at this. I find this so unconvincing that I've never quite been aware of this notion. When we deal with Xing now in a typical history of literature course, it's always stimulus, and then we deal with how that Guangguan Zhujiu might match to the virtue of the consort. This stuff is a little strange. They're claiming that you see something good happening, and you'd like to praise it, but you don't want to be too fawning and flattering, so you come up with a comparison. And that would render Xing, at least as commented on in the context of Zhou Li, that would render Xing as the flattering comparison. But that's not a very satisfying thing. I doubt it works very well in the Xiaoxu. I haven't gone through them to see if all of the Xing are actually flattering. There are better ways to deal with this. So, let's start again with Lun Yu and look at it. First, it seems that in these passages, it's quite clear that Xing is something that you do with a complete poem or with some poetry. It's not something you do within a poem. It's a function of use of poems. So, what can you do with it? 可以xing? What does that mean exactly? Lots of people have wondered about that. Let's go off a little bit and think of the other things that are being claimed here. I'm sorry, xing yu shu, I think that fits together rather nicely, but let's just talk about the other things that are being claimed. You can use it for observation. Of course, we had an episode of that. Right? Listening to someone recite or speak poetry will be a way of getting at them. Some kind of thinking of Stephen Van Zoren's whole notion of the hermeneutics of personality there. That's interesting. Observation. Gather people together, and I speculate that the shi, as the words that go with song, might have been the thing that invokes, reminds you of the melody that goes with the song. Might have been the trigger for the whole music, and that wouldn't necessarily be Qun. Multiple musicians, perhaps, multiple singers, Qun, sharing. We can imagine other ways of grouping that might have to do with using shi poetry, especially ritual occasions of sacrifice. But I want to speculate about these other ones too. And then finally, 可以变, remonstrance would be a good example of notion here of a kind of service that you can complete when you're using poetry. And I connect that again with the Wu Yu passage. So there are multiple functions. They're all clearly related to a whole poem, a group of poems, a use of poetry, not poetic composition. Back to Xing. Xing is most often found in this sense, rather like Xingshi, to mobilize, to get something moving, to stand it up, to start it up. And we have an example here from BT where we're mobilizing the feathers of dancing and the pipes that go with musical performance. Now, sorry. Moving on to Zhongyong. Here is another suggestive use of Xing. I'm not quite sure how to handle the parallelism here because it doesn't work especially well, at least in my understanding of it. But when the state has the way, then a worthy is the person being referred to. His words are sufficient to Xing, to get something started, to start good things going, start the ritual system going. The problem is you come around to the parallel when the state is without the way, I mean, that makes more sense. His silence is enough to allow him to be tolerated or allow him to be contained. It is possible to take that first line as his words are sufficient to allow him to rise in position, but I'm not convinced by that yet either. So what about the Xing as it appears in these xiaoxu, right? That's the use we're most familiar with if we're readers of the Mao Shi. What do we do with this? So here's an example of a thing that is actually identified as Xing within the xiaoxu. And it's Ge Han, one of the first poems. And sure, it does work as a way of praising the person by praising the way that this vine grows and so forth. So maybe that notion of Xing as the positive but non-flattering analogy would work. I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence in earlier texts for that. Xing doesn't seem to be connected earlier on with any sort of metaphor or analogy. It doesn't seem to be about comparing one thing to another. I think that what ends up being most convincing for me is that the figure of the vine, or perhaps the poem as a whole, was used to hold up, to praise, to encourage wifely behavior, or at least that's what the Mao commentators thought. So you're using this perhaps in the context of a wedding or something to hold up, praise, celebrate the proper form of wifely behavior. Certainly a possibility, but it does go through that notion of mobilizing somehow. All right, let's move on to Feng. Been speaking for almost 40 minutes now. In the Shiraxu, we have a lot of emphasis on Feng as a top-down influence, and we're all familiar with that. It's only at the end of this little passage that we start to see the bottom-to-top vision. And I must say the bottom-to-top vision of Feng is the one that actually has much more resonance outside of Shiraxu. You do find some sort of Feng from the top to bottom elsewhere, but there's much more of this kind of grassroots critiquing and the kind of the rise of language from below. Notice especially this emphasis on crafty remonstrance. There it is again, 主文而全见, echoing things we've seen in Zhoubi already. And it is to be done using the language of the existing language of the Shi. Notice that there's a function of instruction, like that order of remonstrance we were talking about in Zuozhuang earlier. This fits with that vision, that somehow the ruler is surrounded by layers of remonstrating officials who are using Shi or whatever they might use to do their remonstrance. So the suggestion here is that Feng is a mode of using a song not a type of song. And I think as I go through this, I'm less and less convinced that this so-called 四时, 风, 大雅, 小雅 song. I think that's a later imposition. It leads me to wonder whether those things were even known under those categories. Because you see, by the time we get around to the end, there's very little support for the notion that those 160 songs would originally have been thought of as all being folk, or that those final songs would all have been thought of as song. Here instead, there seems to be a focus in this passage, and I'll have some others, on the way you use a song. So what do you do with it in the case of feng? What is it to feng someone? Let's look back at that Gong's Jiayu passage. The fifth of these was feng jian, and I'm really going to identify feng as it is found in Shi Da Xu. I'm going to argue that that is a residue, an echo, a reflex of the order of remonstrance, of feng jian. What really is being envisioned is a speech that may contain some poetry, may not, but it's a form of critique through indirection. It becomes difficult as we go further into Shi Da Xu, because the Shi Da Xu starts talking about things bian feng and bian yan. I don't quite know what to do with these. The traditional way to handle them is the one advanced here. Times were changing, things were falling apart, so that's where the changed feng and the changed ya came about. I want to tweak it slightly, since I don't necessarily believe that all of this was talking about how poems were composed. I want to look for other ways how poems were used. We notice that there is reference to feng as an activity of critiquing people above. It does have to do with emotions. It seems to come out as an expression of emotions. But, and I've failed to highlight the necessary passages here, it turns out to be done in a context of, there it is, done in a context of remonstrating about the loss of norms. Right? If you look at these highlighted lines here, this is a setting in which everything's falling apart. And that's the time when the bian feng and the bian yan come along. Clearly have a feng activity that's coming out of emotions that go with this time of disorder. And I want to suggest that, given the other stuff that's happening in this passage, maybe we could go so far as to think of the users of poetry the way they're described here, as people who really understand the principles of success and failure, people who understand what in other contexts we would call quan bian. Could it be that bian feng and bian ya are the things you use when you are calculating about success and failure? Is that the world of bian that we're thinking of? Not bian as a matter of decadence from old norms, but bian in that very warring states context of change, manipulation, quick calculation. I don't know. There is something about individuality, clearly. This line from Shi Da Xu stands out. What I'm interested in is the 一国士, naturally. Because if you set out to go from Luwu to Jin to participate in a banquet, or you're going to do some recitation, this is the problem. How do you manage to recite, perform in such a way that 一国士习人之本? You're on the spot. You have to translate. You have to respond with your own initiative. I think that's what's going on here. And that takes the pressure off Shi Yan Zhi, or Shi Zhen Zhi Su Zhi. It's very common to connect that phrase with this, as if it's all about personal expression. I'm not sure it is. Right? Sure, the ruler of Jin wanted to see the seven from Zheng express their Zhi. I'm not sure it's about individual private stuff. It seems to be more about representing in a broader sense. Here, representation of the state, possibly in a context of diplomatic use of Shi poetry. This leads us naturally to Ya. Here's what the commentaries, here's what Shi Da Xu has to say about it, that this is somehow a national level, I shouldn't say national, it's somehow a much broader thing, a realm But then we also get 亚洲正言 and 王州之所以飞行. So connecting it with the royal house and the administration of the royal house, really getting it away from particulars and pointing to that